The First World War often seems to us like something distant, black and white photographs, old maps, forgotten names of generals. But behind these old frames lies its most terrifying secret, an entire generation of young people who never got the chance to truly live their lives. A generation that was never allowed to grow old. A generation that came back from the front as strangers, broken, or never came back at all. It was called the Lost Generation. Today, we will not talk about generals, diplomats, or political declarations. We will talk about those who sat in the trenches, about those who were 18, 20, 25 years old, about the guys who just yesterday went to school, dreamed of love, of a career, of a future, and already tomorrow lay face down in a shell crater. It'll all be over by Christmas. How the youth went to war. The summer of 1914 in Europe began like a celebration. Newspapers wrote that the war would be quick and victorious. Politicians promised that the soldiers will be home by Christmas. Crowds of people poured into the streets, seeing off conscripts with flowers, music, and flags. For many young men, it felt like an adventure. In Germany, students volunteered for the army, afraid the war would end before they had a chance to take part in it. In France, teenagers lied about their age so they would be accepted at the front. In Britain, friends went together in whole school classes, university groups, football teams. This is how the so-called PALS battalions appeared, when an entire battalion consisted of boys from one town or even one neighborhood. Romanticism, patriotism, faith in their country. All of this merged into one powerful emotional wave. Teachers told graduates, "You are going to defend the homeland." Parents, often raised themselves in a spirit of military honor, were proud of their sons. Girls promised to wait. It seemed this would be the last great test of the old world, and then a new, just era would begin. No one understood the main thing. Europe was stepping not into a quick campaign, but into a 4-year meat grinder that would grind down millions of young lives, trenches instead of university. What the life of the lost generation at the front looked like, imagine a boy who is 19 years old. Yesterday, he was sitting at his desk, preparing for exams, arguing with friends about books, listening to music, falling in love, dreaming of going to another city, entering university, starting his own business. He had plans, hopes, fears, doubts, everything any young person has. Now let's move him into 1915. He has already been living in a trench for a year. His new university is a trench dug in the mud. His lectures are artillery barrages. His practical training is an attack under machine gun fire. Every morning, he wakes up from cold and damp. There is water in the trench up to his ankles. The walls crumble. Rats are everywhere. His body is constantly freezing. His feet are rotting from the endless wet. This is how trench foot appears. A terrible condition when the skin cracks, rots, and toes can literally fall off. Letters from home arrive less and less often. The friends he went to war with disappear one by one. Some are killed by shells. Some go missing. Some lie wounded in a hospital, if they were lucky enough to make it there. Every day, the same picture: grey sky, mud, barbed wire, screams of the wounded, the smell of gunpowder, burning and decay, and somewhere very far away, a peaceful life that goes on without him. Numbers beyond imagination. How many young lives the war took. To understand the scale of the tragedy, it is enough to look at the numbers. The First World War claimed the lives of about 10 million soldiers. Even more, around 20 million, were wounded. Most of them were young men between 18 and 30 years old. In other words, the war struck directly at the youngest, most active, most promising layer of society. But dry numbers are only the tip of the iceberg. Behind every number, there is a story. A boy who dreamed of becoming an engineer, a student who wanted to write books, a son his parents were waiting for, a fiancé who never managed to get married, a father who will never see his child. In some villages and towns, almost all the men went to the front, and many never returned. In Britain, entire PALS battalions died in a single day. Imagine a school graduating class where, in one moment, almost all the boys are gone forever. Only framed photographs and names on memorial plaques remain. For mothers, this war became an endless chain of death notices. For young women, a generation in which there weren't enough men. For entire countries, a demographic catastrophe, the consequences of which were felt for decades. Not only the dead, the wounded, the crippled, the shattered lives. Those who survived often envied the dead. Many came back from the front without arms, without legs, with severe wounds, with faces disfigured by shrapnel. The First World War gave rise to a terrible phenomenon, the broken faces. Surgeons tried to reconstruct noses, jaws, and eyes. The first prostheses appeared, the first attempts at plastic surgery. Artists made masks out of metal and leather to at least partially hide the horrific injuries. Imagine a young man who before the war was handsome, healthy, full of strength. He was in love, dreamed of a family and a career. He returns home, but when he looks in the mirror, he doesn't recognize himself. His face is scars, an empty eye socket, a metal plate instead of a jaw. He is afraid to go outside, afraid of children's stares, afraid of pity. And these are only the physical wounds. Much deeper are the psychological wounds. Back then, no one knew the word PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They simply said nervous exhaustion, shell shock, whining. But in reality, thousands of veterans every night relived the same thing in their heads. Explosions, screams, the deaths of their comrades. They had nightmares. They woke up in a cold sweat. They flinched at any loud sound. It was hard for them to be around people. They felt the world no longer understood them. The gap between front and home. Why veterans felt like outsiders. One of the most painful aspects for the lost generation was the gap between the front and civilian life. Those who stayed in the rear, of course, also suffered. There was hunger, shortages, fear for loved ones. But they still lived in a relatively normal world. They went to shops, theatres, schools. They could enjoy the sun, fall in love, argue about politics. The soldiers lived in a different dimension. And when they returned, they often felt no one understands them. What could a frontline soldier talk about? About how he sat for 3 days next to a friend's body because he could not bury him under shell fire? About how he listened to a man slowly dying in no man's land, and no one could crawl out to him? About how he himself shot at people who were just as young as he was? Society wanted to hear stories about heroism and victories. But the real experience of the front is not a heroic movie. It is fear, mud, senseless attacks, orders that seemed insane. Many veterans felt like strangers. They looked at people in cafes, at couples in love, at children, and understood that there was now a chasm between them. Their inner life remained forever tied to the trenches, and there was no escape from that. The lost generation in literature. When pain is explained with words, after the war, this pain spilled out into art. Writers, poets, and artists tried to explain what they themselves or their friends had gone through. In literature, the term lost generation appears. It is not just a beautiful expression. It is a diagnosis of an entire era. Young people who survived the war felt that their old world had died. The old values, honor, heroism, patriotism, seemed to them empty words used to cover up a slaughter. Religious and moral guidelines had collapsed. Faith in progress, in human reason, in a bright future, was undermined. In their place came a feeling of emptiness, cynicism, and disappointment. In novels and memoirs by former frontline soldiers, the same themes appear again and again: loss of meaning, alienation from society, inability to return to former life, constant memories of war that will not let go. Writers describe soldiers not as heroes, but as victims of a huge system they did not choose. For many of them, the real war ended in 1918, but the inner war continued for the rest of their lives, a generation that never gave birth to the next. There is another terrifying side of the lost generation, the children who were never born. When millions of young men die or return crippled, it is not only their personal tragedy, it means they will not have children, that families which could have formed will never form, that entire villages and towns will never restore their former numbers. In some countries after the First World War, a serious demographic gap appeared. In the following decades, one can trace holes in birth statistics, simply because there were not enough men of marriageable age. Girls remained unmarried. Families were incomplete. Many women lived alone, having lost fiancés and husbands at the front. So the war destroyed not only millions of young lives, it stole millions of future lives that could have been born. Stories instead of numbers, what the tragedy looked like in the fate of one person. To grasp the scale of the lost generation, sometimes one concrete story is enough. Imagine a young man from a small town. He is 18. He has just finished school. He has a girlfriend he meets with in the evenings. He dreams of becoming a teacher, or an engineer, or a musician. He lives an ordinary life that seems endless to him. The war begins. He volunteers, not because he thirsts for blood, but because everyone does it. Because he was raised to believe that defending the homeland is a duty. Because he does not want to seem a coward in front of his friends and family. A year later, he is no longer the laughing teenager he once was. He is in a trench. He sees death every day. He is used to people dying beside him minutes after talking to them. One morning, they are ordered to attack. He runs forward across a field wet from rain and blood. A machine gun is firing in his direction. He feels a sharp pain in his chest or stomach. He falls. There are screams around him. Above him is a grey sky. He tries to breathe, but he can't. He thinks of home, of his mother, of the girl he never got to say goodbye to. And a few minutes later, he is gone. For statistics, he is one of millions of dead. For his family, it is the end of the world. For his unborn children, it is a future that has vanished. And there were millions of such stories. Why it is important to remember this today, you might ask. Why do we need to know all this? Why talk about war again and again if more than 100 years have passed? The answer is simple. As long as we remember the lost generation, we still have a chance not to lose the next one. The First World War showed how quickly a civilized world can turn into a factory of death. How easily slogans about honor, glory, and patriotism can become justification for senseless slaughter. How an entire generation can be sacrificed to the ambitions of politicians, the mistakes of generals, and the thirst for revenge. This generation of young people, those who died in the trenches, who returned maimed, who lived their whole lives with invisible wounds in their souls, left us a terrible legacy and at the same time an important warning. They never got to live their lives, but we can at least try to learn from their fate. Memory is a duty to those who did not return today. All across Europe and around the world, there are memorials to the unknown soldier. On the graves it is written, "Name unknown." But the point is not that nobody knows his name. The point is that he is a symbol of everyone. Each such soldier is part of the lost generation. Each one is someone's story cut off mid-sentence. When we look at old photographs where young men in uniform smile before heading to the front, it is important to remember most of them had no idea what awaited them. They thought they were going to a beautiful war, a short campaign. They believed the words of adults, politicians, newspapers. Instead, they got earth, mud, gas, machine guns, and death. Our duty to them is not just mourning. Our duty is to remember how easily an entire generation can be lost, how fragile the human future is, how important each seemingly ordinary life is. Instead of an epilogue, what it means to be a lost generation. The lost generation is not only those who died, it is also those who survived but never found themselves after the war, those whose youth passed between trenches and hospitals, those who formally returned home but inwardly stayed there in 1914 to 1918. They lived on, but a constant shadow lay on their shoulders, dead comrades, lost hopes, a youth that had been destroyed. We often talk about heroes, generals, dates, and battles, but perhaps the main lesson of the First World War lies in the fate of ordinary young people whom this war took away. Because history is not only maps and treaties. History is, above all, human lives. And if millions of young people turned into a lost generation, it means that at some moment humanity lost its mind. And our task is to do everything so that this never happens again.